Quote, I hate to say it, but I believe it is time to start covering the Brian Herbert, Kevin J. Anderson canon. I share many of your judgments about the books completely. They are difficult to start, harder to finish, but they are still part of the larger Dune universe, for better or for worse, regardless of anyone's opinions about the writing quality or their hierarchical position in the canon or the hubris that went into their inception. End quote. And Jalen goes on to mention that for Dune fans who have read the Brian Herbert books, they've done whatever personal work they needed to get through those books. There really aren't that many places talking about those books in any serious, entertaining, fun, thorough way. And Jalen finishes their email, quote, please, please, please consider expanding, end quote. And Madison continued in her message from earlier, quote, I think it would be fun to speculate how Frank meant to follow up Chapter House given your understanding of all the foreshadowing he hides in plain sight. Also, I just need to hear someone rant about how bad Hunters and Sandworms is. End quote. So what do you say, Abu? Do you want to talk about Brian Herbert books?
I mean, I don't want to, but Jalen's message was actually quite convincing, I will say.
Agreed.
As much as I am dedicated to the art of what we do, I'm also quite a strategically minded person, and Jalen's point that there isn't really a space online to talk deeply, as deeply as you can talk about the Brian Herbert books.
Good footnote, yeah.
And, to me, I'm like, okay, if there's an audience there, and if it still helps us continue growing the podcast and continuing cultivating a community and space where people can talk about these things, and it still like sort of aligns with our strategic goals, because at the end of the day, we are creating a podcast in a space that we love, but also we're running a business that has bills and things need to make money, and things have to get paid. People have to get paid. So yeah, I think honestly, like Jalen's pitch to me is less a convincing argument that I should read more Brian Herbert books, but perhaps more of a convincing argument that this could strategically benefit from covering Brian Herbert books. I'm a little more open to it. I still don't want to, deep down in my heart of hearts, I don't want to, but I do think as we cover things like the Dune Prophecy HBO show and other potential properties that crop up in this universe, there like the just kind of is the reality that we live in Brian Herbert's Dune universe. There's no avoiding it. And as more Dune things happen in the future and as we cover them, there will be less and less. The option to avoid Brian's work will be less and less. We're already having to tackle much of it head on in our coverage of Dune Prophecy, the HBO show. So I'm open to the idea. I think we still have some time for what it's worth. We still have to get through Heretics. We still have to get through all of Chapter House, which is a very dense book. And to Madison's point, I would actually like to get through Hunters and Sandworms. Maybe not in as deep dive book club style, but I would still like to, quote unquote, complete the series that Frank would have envisioned for whatever it's worth. So I think we have time to figure out how we'll tackle the Brian strategy in the future. What do you think, though?
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning. We actually do have an episode planned, which is going to cover Sisterhood of Dune.
It's true, yeah.
And it's not going to be covering it in the same way that like Heretics is being covered. We didn't go chapter by chapter. I did write chapter summaries for all 100 chapters. Yeah. So I made that available. Enjoy that on Patreon. But ultimately, like, there just isn't that much depth to the books. So our coverage of it would have to look different. Yeah. I'm not opposed. I'm also not opposed. And I appreciate that, like, there are fans out there who either don't like Jalen doesn't sound like the number one Brian Herbert fan. I think you're right. Like, keep in mind, listeners, that an episode of Gom Jabbar takes like 20 hours of work.
Yeah.
And we have to be making the business decision of, can we afford to spend that time on this thing? And if people aren't going to listen to it and aren't going to enjoy it, we shouldn't do it. just from a
Exactly.
time standpoint.
Yeah.
So if if we were making a podcast for Brian Herbert fans, I genuinely don't think there's enough of them who are like staunch
That's kind
he
of how
can
I
do
feel,
no
yeah.
wrong fans. I think the much larger demographic are Frank Herbert fans who have sort of like, okay, Frank Herbert fans who have sort of gotten to that point of going, well, it's not the same. You know, Jalen proposed maybe you even think of it as like a separate timeline or an alternate universe that's very similar, right? Multiverse solves all.
Yeah.
This
True.
is the dark timeline.
True.
Or whatever. One of my big critiques of Brian's books is that they are very long and not very well trimmed. So there's a lot of really annoying fluff. So I don't know. We're not opposed. We do have to get through Frank's books. I like the idea, Abu, of doing finishing Chapter House, doing a like 2 or 3 episode series on
Agreed.
Hunter Sandworms,
Yep.
and then a final episode to be like, here's what we think. Like to Madison's question, here's what we think based on what we know as like lore experts. Here's what we think Frank would have done. Especially
many of our listeners have asked us that over the years, you know.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, how would you finish Frank's story after book 6?
Based on his everything.
Based on everything you know.
Yeah.
And I'm hesitant to respond to that question yet because I want to get through our book club series and I want to get through our deep dive research first. But I think that is an episode we will for sure do once we get through all of that.
And then once that episode's done, we will probably have to step back and look at what Gom Jabbar is going to be after having gone through all of Frank's writings.
Yeah.
And one of the real possibilities.
All the encyclopedia.
Practically all the, by that time, for sure. I mean, we're talking about a year and change out. So for sure, there's a decision that we have to make at some point. What I would say for anybody who wants us to cover Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson books, listen to our Sisterhood episode when it's out. If you are on the public feed, it might already be out. If you're on the Patreon feed, it's coming at some point. Listen to that. Give us your feedback. Let us know what you think about it. And let us know now. Let us know now how you want us to cover those books. Do you want us to treat it as if it is the same canonicity, even though it like regularly conflicts with the stuff?
Yeah.
Like a lot of the shit we've talked about over the last 4 years is just out the window if we're taking it seriously as like Dune world building.
Yeah.
How do you want us to handle that? Like, what would you prefer? Let us know. It's a decision we're going to have to make eventually. And the more we know what you want, the better we'll be able to provide that.
Yeah. For now, we're going to continue procrastinating on that decision.
Yeah. Let's kick that can as hard as we can so it's way down the road.